out on Posey Island, and it's an interesting island because it's part of the National Monument, but it's managed as a campsite by state parks. And so we're doing a weed mapping project for the National Monument, for the Bureau of Land Management. So we're going out to these small islands, relocating patches of weeds that we mapped back in 2016, and looking for new patches.
On this particular one, Posey Island, they have a Class B noxious weed called shiny geranium. And the last time I was out here several years ago, there wasn't very much, but now it's spread quite a lot. And we're seeing it on both Orcas and San Juan Island too. So that's one we hope to get under control.
In the campground in particular, centered in this area that people have been coming and going a lot, it's lawn grasses, Eurasian grasses that people bring in from the larger islands inadvertently, and weeds like the shining geranium, which is our main concern here because it's a really aggressive weed recently introduced into parts of the islands here.
Very likely they came in accidentally, maybe on humans who were visiting. Since this is a campground, it may have come in on someone's clothing. It's also possible that it came in through wildlife.
And it's taking over this little island, being spread again inadvertently by just having a lot of people camping and picnicking here and walking around and carrying it around the island, and sadly carrying it then from this island to other small islands that are on the water trails here, the kayak trails around the county.
We don't get out to these islands very often, so looking for anything that's informative to the Bureau of Land Management. So evidence of disturbance, evidence of wildlife use, changes in vegetation altogether, fire, what have you.
This is unfortunately what's left of an archaeological site after the state parks folks leveled this area for picnic tables. Unfortunately, at a time when there wasn't as good oversight of such things.
I've got my eye sort of focused on mostly vertebrate activity, but also resources that vertebrates might be using. Things like snails and slugs and ants and whatever else. Taking a look at the scat that I see here. Tons of otter sign. Just big bare patches of dirt that you can see the otters are just taking dust baths in. So they've sort of scraped all the vegetation out and dug it all up, and now they just roll around in the dirt.
The Bureau of Land Management will be doing some weed control on these islands eventually, and they would like to be able to, when they do any kind of disturbance, to immediately reseed in with native species that are appropriate. So knowing what else grows on these islands is important, and also potentially which species could be collected from for reseeding the island so they can sort of stay within the same genetic mix, the same adapted species. There's quite extensive great camas on the east side of it. There's a beautiful patch of fool's onion, or Tritolea hyacinthina. It's a kind of brodia that looks a bit like an onion but doesn't smell like one. There's native junipers all over the island.
If you find large junipers on a small island, it's generally because the indigenous inhabitants of the San Juan Islands didn't clear it routinely, left it untouched, ungardened, largely just left in a natural state, typically associated with places where there were burials rather than fish camps or gardens. I'll be looking again for, as I am on all of these small islands, for any remaining rock piles that could have been cairn burials, just so that we know if we're doing weed treatment or any rehabilitation of these landscapes to leave those alone. Some little islands were then used for sheep, for example. Put sheep on them. It's a kind of a natural corral. Some of them were settled, had houses on them, but in many cases it was just that they were used for picnicking and camping all the way back 140, 150 years ago by Euro-Americans, and if there were burials on these small islands, they removed them.
Up on the island, where conditions are better, you have mostly non-native grasses, but here where conditions are really challenging, the native grasses have an advantage because they're adapted to the salt.
Madrona knows a lot about plants, so I learn quite a bit from her every time I come out.
What we're talking about within the team right now is that the shining geranium is so extensive. There's just so much of it here now, far more than we expected from our last survey, that we're going to need to bring a much larger crew here to be able to get the work done in a day or two.
We're going to have to make some recommendations to the Bureau of Land Management of how they can manage that, recommending that they work with Jason and the San Juan County Weed Control, because it's beyond our expertise as biologists of what the appropriate way of dealing with this is.
So it has to be a carefully planned battle with extensive rapid removal and replacement of the weeds, replacement with native plants.
Despite all the disturbance, there's actually quite a lot left of this island to look after. And so what we're hoping is that what we learn can help the Bureau of Land Management look after it well. And that while our focus right now is weeds, because that's the current concern, I think we really want to make recommendations for the stewardship of the island as a whole.